Little Richard arrived at the theater the way Little Richard arrived everywhere, with the particular energy of someone for whom any room he entered immediately became his room, for whom the question of whether he belonged somewhere was not a question that required answering, because the answer was already obvious to everyone present. He was headlining the package tour. This was not a surprise. He had been headlining things since the mid-1950s, since Tutti Frutti and Long Tall Sally, and the recordings that had changed what American popular music understood about itself, that had taken something that was already alive and amplified it until the amplification was the point. Little Richard was not simply a performer. He was an event, in the theatrical sense, a thing that happened to a room, that the room could not prepare for and could not remain unchanged by. His voice was a phenomenon, not in the promotional sense that labels use the word, not as hyperbole, but in the literal sense, something that occurred, that had physical properties you could feel before you could process it as music. It was the highest, most extravagant, most uncontainable thing that popular music had produced by the late 1950s, and he used it with the complete awareness of someone who has always known exactly what he has and has never been inclined to understate it. Etta James was opening the show. She was young, late teens, early 20s, in the early phase of a career that had not yet fully resolved into what it would become. She had her recordings, she had the beginnings of a reputation on the circuit, she had a voice that the people who worked alongside her had already recognized as something outside the ordinary. But she was the opener. She was on before Little Richard, and in the logic of a package tour, that meant she was doing the work of warming a room that the headliner would then receive warmed. She did her set. The room received her the way rooms received good openers, with the appreciation of an audience that has been given more than it expected from the bottom of the bill, that has been warmed, not just in the technical sense, but genuinely moved before the night's main event has even started. She left the stage having done her job better than her position in the running order required. Little Richard watched some of it from the wings. This was not something he did as a general rule. He was not a performer who positioned himself in the wings to observe the openers. He had his own preparations, his own rituals, his own relationship to the hour before he went on that did not usually include standing in the dark watching someone else work. But he had heard something from the corridor, and the something had moved him in the direction of the wing, and he had stood there for a few minutes watching Etta James finish her set. After the show, after his own show, after the full force of a Little Richard performance had passed through the theater and the audience had recovered sufficiently to remember where they were, he found her backstage. Etta James understood, in the second after he finished asking, what the question actually was. It was not, or not primarily, a question about her. It was a question about him. He was asking it through her because he had watched her do something that evening that had raised the question, that had made him want to hear how someone else answered it. But the question was one he was also asking himself, had perhaps been asking himself for years without a satisfactory answer. Little Richard's relationship to performance was the most extravagant in American popular music. He gave everything, always, without visible reserve, the voice, the physicality, the full force of a personality that had never been calibrated for restraint. A Little Richard show was an exercise in total expenditure. He left nothing on the stage because he had given it all to the room. And what the room gave back was the particular exhilaration of having witnessed something that operated outside the normal parameters of what a performance was supposed to be. But total expenditure has a cost that is not always visible from the outside. The people in the audience receive the performance as a gift. From the inside, from the position of the person doing the giving, it is something else. A sustained act of will that requires the person performing to access something real and keep it accessible for the duration of the show, night after night, city after city, with the particular demands of a touring schedule that does not accommodate recovery. What you give on stage, if you are giving something real, comes from somewhere. And the somewhere gets depleted. And the question of whether it refills, and how fast, and what the long-term accounting looks like, that is a question that living in the extravagance of a Little Richard performance made it difficult to ask. He had found a way to ask it through Etta James. She told him the truth. She told him it always took something. She told him she had not found a way to make it not take something, had not been looking for such a way because she wasn't sure it existed, and that she had made a decision at some point, not a formal decision, not something she had sat down and deliberated about, but a decision nonetheless, that the taking was acceptable because of what was left after the taking. That the version of herself that came off stage, having given what she gave, was more real than the version that went on, and that the more real version was worth having, even at the cost of what it took to arrive at it. Little Richard listened. He was not a man who was known for listening. The narrative of his public life was one of speaking, proclaiming, announcing, filling every available space with the full volume of himself. But in that small backstage room, in the quiet after the biggest show of the evening, he was listening to Etta James with the attention of someone who needed to hear what she was saying. The backstage after a Little Richard show was a specific kind of environment. It was not quiet. It was not the reflective space that follows a performance that has asked something private of the audience. It was the aftermath of something that had been deliberately overwhelming, and the people in it were in the state that follows being overwhelmed. Loud, energized, still carrying the residue of what had happened in the theater. His band, his road crew, the promoters and hangers-on who attached themselves to the headliner's orbit, all of them in motion, in conversation, in the animated processing of an evening that had gone the way Little Richard's evenings were supposed to go. He moved through this with the ease of someone for whom this environment was native. He accepted what people offered, the compliments, the observations, the specific kind of adulation that came from people who had just watched him do what he did, and he received it in the manner of someone who has been receiving it for long enough that it no longer required a particular response. He was warm, he was present, he was Little Richard in a backstage corridor, which meant the corridor was an extension of the performance. And then he stepped out of the current of it and went looking for Etta James. She was in a smaller room, not a dressing room exactly, more of a holding area, the kind of space that touring venues assigned to the openers, which were typically smaller and less well-appointed than the spaces reserved for the headliner. She was with one of her musicians, winding down from her own set, in the quieter way that performers wind down when they have given a lot and need time to collect what they gave. Little Richard appeared in the doorway. The musician looked up. Etta looked up. The specific weight of Little Richard's presence in a room that had not been prepared to contain it produced the brief adjustment that his presence always produced in people who had not been expecting him. A recalibration, a moment of processing the gap between the person standing in the doorway and the scale of what they knew him to be. He came in, he sat down, and then, without preamble, without the setup that a question of this nature might have been expected to require, he asked Etta James something that she had not been asked before. He asked her whether she ever got tired of it. Not tired in the ordinary sense, not tired the way you are tired after a long set, or tired the way the road makes you tired, or tired the way a difficult relationship with a label or a manager can make you tired. Tired of it. The whole of it, the performance, the giving, the specific cost that singing the way she sang required her to pay every time she did it. He asked her whether she had found a way to not let it take something from her every time, or whether it always did, or whether she had decided the taking was simply the nature of the work. He said after she finished, "That's the thing I've been trying to figure out." Not as a confession, not with the emotional weight that the words might have carried in a different context, from a different person. He said it matter-of-factly, the way you say something when you have been thinking about it for a long time and have just heard someone articulate a version of it that is close to what you had been circling. He said it, and then he sat back in the chair, and the room was quiet for a moment. They talked for a little while after that, not long, 20 minutes perhaps. The conversation of two people who have just established something unexpected between them and are feeling the edges of it. They did not become friends in any sustained sense. The tour moved on, and they moved with it in their respective positions on the bill. And the kinds of encounters that happen in backstage rooms late at night are not always the kinds that build into something lasting. But the conversation stayed with Etta James for years afterward. Not because of anything specifically said, the specific words blurred with time, the way the specific words of significant conversations always do, but because of the quality of the asking. Little Richard, who had never needed anything from anyone in any room he had ever entered, had come into a small backstage space and asked a question that required an honest answer, and had asked it of her specifically, and had listened to the answer she gave. The question he had asked, whether it always took something, was a question that the performance of Little Richard had always made it difficult for him to ask publicly. The performance said, "I am limitless." The performance said, "The giving costs nothing, because I have everything." The performance was extraordinary and true in its own way, and it had made him one of the most significant figures in the history of American popular music. But it had also created a frame around him that made certain private questions very hard to ask. He had found a way around the frame by asking the question of Etta James, who had been watching from the other end of the performing spectrum, who sang from something interior and real and did not disguise the cost of it, and who could therefore answer him honestly without either of them pretending the question hadn't been asked. Little Richard left rock and roll a few years later to become a minister. He returned, and left again, and returned again, in the oscillation between the sacred and the secular that defined his life in a way that the performances alone could not contain. Whether the question he had asked in a backstage room was connected to that oscillation is something only he could have answered, and he answered it differently at different times. What remained, in Etta James's memory of that night, was simpler than any of the larger narrative. A man who seemed to have everything had sat down across from her after a show and asked her a question about cost, and she had told him the truth. And for a few minutes in a small room, Little Richard had been entirely quiet. That was the thing nobody expected. Not from him. Not in that room. Not that night.